Welcome to EPG Patashala. I am Professor Ganesha Somayaji from Goa University. Now I am going to discuss nationalist responses to colonial education in India. In pre-British India or in pre-colonial India, given the economic conditions and political environment, the national consciousness of the present type could not emerge. Actually, the introduction of colonial education itself is one of the major reasons for emergence of national consciousness in India. Once emerged, the national consciousness led to nationalist feelings among Indians, and they started to look at everything that has come from colonizers with a critical perspective. And hence, we have multiple nationalist responses to colonial education in India, which we are going to discuss in this module. After introducing the theme, we will now look into the role played by colonial education in the emergence of Indian nationalism. In his historical materialist analysis of the emergence and development of Indian nationalism, Desai conceives 5 chief phases of its development. As and when it advanced, its social base broadened. Though the widening of the social base of Indian nationalism during the later phases of Indian freedom struggle was due to a number of other factors and forces, its narrow social base during the first phase consisted of the intelligentsia who were the product of modern education imparted in the new educational institutions established by the British in India during the first decades of the 19th century. This phase extended till 1885 and culminated in the rise of the Indian National Congress in that year. The emergence and growth of Western type of nationalism itself is one of the latent consequences of the introduction of modern Western education by the colonizers. The introduction of modern education in India was primarily motivated by the political, administrative and economic needs of British and the other colonial masters in India. The expanding empire in India and the expanding trade in India necessitated a large pool of educated manpower well versed in English, considered as instrumentalist version by later analysts like Kumar. We also find such views in Desai's analysis of the reasons for the introduction of English education for Indians. These educational institutions provided clerks for the government and commercial offices, lawyers versed in the structure and processes of the new legal system, doctors trained in modern medical science, technicians and teachers. Desai recognizes another motivation for the introduction of English education in India, which is the Anglicizing program suggested by some enlightened Britishers. As against those who advocated education in Oriental knowledge in Sanskrit and Persian, the Anglicists were convinced that the British culture was the best and the most liberal in the world, and if and when India and other colonies and later on the entire world were anglicized culturally, it would pave for the political unification of the world. To get an idea of such a sentiment, we may refer to the views of Macaulay in his famous Minutes dated 2nd February 1835. Macaulay writes, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." Unquote Macaulay. While the idea that the British introduced modern education to train clerks has wide currency, Kumar considers it as theoretically feeble and historically untenable. Its theoretical weakness lies in the fact that it does not help us to distinguish between the ideas underlying the educational system and its practical purposes. A plain view of colonial education as a factory producing clerks is a purely instrumentalist viewpoint which cannot be supported by facts. Along with producing clerks, colonial education also produced the nationalist leaders and many professionals and intellectuals, not just office clerks. Kumar succinctly summarizes the complex and multifaceted influence of colonial education on Indian society, writes, quotation begins, "No simple model or statement will help us understand why colonial education had the kinds of effects it had. It socialized many into colonial values. At the same time, it turned many of its products against those values. The rejection of colonial education may not have been sustained for long periods, but the broader rejection of colonial rule was sustained, and we cannot ignore the role of education in inspiring this rejection." Indian nationalism emerged under conditions of political subjugation of Indian people by the British. Introduction of modern education is one among several other radical changes such as centralized administration and modern means of transport and communication that the British introduced in India. A complex mix of all these factors and processes together facilitated the emergence and growth of nationalism in India. Now we are discussing nationalist responses to colonial education. During the vast span of colonial rule in India, there were multiple responses by nationalists to colonial education. Different types of nationalisms emerged and developed during this period. Nationalist attempt to politically unite the Indian people to demand for independence was just the latest version of nationalism. Soon after the introduction of colonial education, various leaders attempted to unite Indians and build a new India on the basis of their conceptions of the essence of Indian culture and requirements of their time. Reform, revival, social well-being, and achieving political freedom from colonial rule were some of the ideologies that guided formation of associations and activities of national leaders from time to time. Let us discuss the responses of various nationalist leaders to colonial education. We will discern their critique of colonial education and programs of action. Introduction of modern education and early socio-religious reform movements is our present concern. In the early decades of the 19th century, the responses to Western education were in the form of reform movements in India. They were religious reform movements which preceded the emergence of nationalism in India. Such movements were harbingers of national awakening even in the West. Medieval feudal religion was not suited to the new modern living conditions. Therefore, anti-religious revolt preceded the secular national political revolt against feudal religion. In India also, the first national awakening expressed itself in the form of a series of religious reform movements. Some movements aimed at reforming the traditional religion in the spirit of liberal principles, and other movements aimed at reviving the pure forms of socio-religious conditions existed in ancient times. The first of such movements is the Brahma Samaj, established in 1928 by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who is considered as the father of Indian nationalism. He was a democrat and a humanist. The Brahma Samaj was not merely a religious reform movement. It included in its program items of social and political reform. The Raja advocated English education for Indians. He stood for the freedom of the press. By advocating liberal Western education and by supporting socially relevant legislation such as the ban on sati, Rama Mohan Roy inaugurated the modern age in India. This movement was the precursor of other social reform movements such as the Brahma Samaj founded by M.G. Ranade in 1867 in Mumbai, and the initial secular programs of the Indian National Congress. Desai succinctly summarizes the contributions of the Brahma Samaj thus, quote Desai: "The Brahma Samaj inaugurated a new era for the Indian people by proclaiming the principles of individual freedom, national unity, solidarity and collaboration, and democratization of all social institutions and social relations. It was the first organized expression of their national awakening," unquote Desai. Revivalist nationalist responses to colonial education. During the later decades of the 19th century, Western educated Indians became a separate category of Indians who started to gather together and discuss the reasons for backwardness of India, which they started to conceive as one national entity. The formation of the Indian National Congress by these educated Indians was a major historical event in the history of Indian nationalism. The first phase of the growth of Indian nationalism corresponds to this event. This period from 1885 to 1905 constitutes the second phase, which saw the expansion of the social base of Indian nationalism with the inclusion of the educated middle class, which had grown in size due to the expansion of educational facilities. These initial nationalists were not against the colonial rule, but facilitated the educated Indians to form a class by themselves to urge the rulers to introduce reforms in governance. They voiced such demands as Indianization of services, associating the Indians in administration, and stopping economic drain. According to Kumar, the views of early Indian nationalists on the role of colonial education show some homonymy between the early nationalist and the colonial perspective. Except Gandhi, who rejected English education, even Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who founded the revivalist movement Arya Samaj, and Balagangadhar Tilak, who represented the extremist nationalist group in their earlier career, accepted the need for English education in India. In the schools started by the Arya Samaj, English education was included in the curriculum. Referring to the biographies of Dayananda Saraswati and Tilak, Kumar observes, quote Kumar, "In the case of Dayanand and Tilak, the initial acknowledgement of the advantages of English education later turned into a radical opposition to it. In the first edition of Dayanand's Satyartha Prakash, English education was appreciated for the opportunities it offered for employment." Similar views were held by Tilak in the initial years of his political career. He preferred secular English education to religious education imparted in traditional schools. He was instrumental in naming a famous school in Pune as New English School. His views underwent a drastic change in his later career. Later on, he adopted an extremely critical stand against English education. Following the efforts of Madan Mohan Malaviya to establish a Hindu university at Banaras, Tilak's vision of education as an agency for cultural revival became an important ingredient of his political aims. Gokhale and Lajpat Rai on colonial education. While comparatively examining the views of Gokhale and Lajpat Rai on the role of British education on the progress of India, Kumar finds a clear position taken by Gokhale and an ambivalent one by Lajpat Rai. Considering English education as necessary for the progress of Indians, Gokhale criticized the colonial government for restricted expansion of education, especially primary education. He wanted to expand free and compulsory primary education for all children and attempted to bring about legislation in the Imperial Legislative Council. His fervent plea for expansion of modern education in India shows his recognition of the positive impact of the colonial education, though he was aware of the negative impact of the same. Lajpat Rai was Gokhale's contemporary in Lahore, who pursued his interest in education throughout his political career and wrote a book entitled The Problem of National Education in India, which was published in 1920 as a commentary on the efforts made since the Swadeshi movement to develop a national model of education. During his visit to America in 1905, he studied the American education system and was influenced by the Spencerian ideas of evolution and progress. He was associated with the formation of Arya Samaj educational institutions and at the same time believed that India needed modern education. The ambivalence and lack of clarity notwithstanding, Lajpat Rai was concerned with educational reforms in India. Sometimes he even criticized the British for not expanding modern educational facilities in India. Responses of Tagore and Gandhi to colonial education. The views and pedagogic programs of Tagore and Gandhi were in consonance with their contrasting positions in response to advancement of science and technology in modern Europe. Tagore was fascinated by the epistemology of science and achievements of science and technology in solving the problems of mankind. This view he continued almost till the fag end of his life, and he only changed it after witnessing the devastating effects of World War II. Both his Shantiniketan and Sriniketan experiments need to be looked at from Tagore's orientation to the Western liberal scientific education. Tagore criticized and rejected the Western education model only towards the end of his life. But Gandhi's rejection was more pronounced and consistent throughout. Gandhi's rejection of colonial education was much stronger than that of Tagore. Gandhi rejected not only Western education but the Western civilization in its entirety. Quoting Gandhi, Kumar writes, quote Gandhi, "The fact that Western men had spent all their energy, industry and enterprise in plundering and destroying other races was evidence enough for Gandhi that Western civilization was in a state of sorry mess. Therefore, it could not possibly be a symbol of progress or something worth imitating or transplanting in India." Analyzing further, Kumar states that such a reaction is neither a type of xenophobia nor a symptom of a revivalist dogma. Both anti-Westernism and a version of militant nationalism are missing in Gandhi's educational ideology and program. Gandhi wanted India to move away from the Western concept of progress. He wanted an education that would lead India on an alternate path of development more suitable to its geography and culture. In Hind Swaraj, he developed dialectic between man versus machine. Here man represented the whole of mankind and the machine represented the industrial system of production. The scathing criticism of modernity, which Gandhi explicated in Hind Swaraj, was a commentary on the tragic affliction. The idea of basic education, which Gandhi attempted to experiment in later decades of his life, stems from his idea of making the whole of humanity less dependent on machines. Let us conclude by commenting on the colonial encounter in education in India and the nationalist responses to colonial education. The colonial intervention in education in India aimed at achieving certain goals prescribed for themselves by the colonial administrators. All the three colonial administrators, the British, the Portuguese and the French, failed to inspire or expand mass education in India. Nationalist responses to colonial education too had its own weaknesses. All the experiments made during colonial rule in India to bring about transformations in educational system by Gokhale or Gandhi or Tagore could not continue after independence in India. Thank you.